All right, guys, we are on chapter 9, Ivan Turgenev's First Love. From that day, my passion began. What I experienced then, I remember, was something similar to what a man must feel when first given an official post. I had ceased to be simply a young boy. I was someone in love. I say that my passion began from that day, and I might add that my suffering began on that day too. In Zenaita's absence, I pined. I could not concentrate. I could not do the simplest thing. For whole days, I did nothing but think intensely about her. I pined away, but her presence brought me no relief. I was jealous and felt conscious of my worthlessness. I was stupidly sulky and stupidly abject. Yet an irresistible force drew me towards her, and it was always with an involuntary shiver of happiness that I went through the door of her room. Zenaida guessed at once that I had fallen in love with her, but then I wouldn't have thought of concealing it. My passion amused her. She made fun of me, played with me, and tormented me. It is sweet to be the sole source, and the arbitrary and irresponsible source of the greatest joys and profoundest miseries to someone else. I was like soft wax in the hands of Zenaida. Not that I alone had fallen in love with her. All the men who had visited the house were hopelessly infatuated, and she kept them all on leading strings at her feet. I was soft wax in the hands of Zenaida. I love this part. I love this part so far. Chapter 9. All the men who visited the house were hopelessly infatuated, and she kept them all on leading strings at her feet. She found it amusing to excite alternate hopes and fears in them, to twist them according to her whim. She called this knocking people against each other. They did not even think of resistance, but gladly submitted to her. In her whole being, vital and beautiful, there was a peculiarly fascinating mixture of cunning and insouciance, artifice and simplicity, gentleness and gaiety. Over everything she did and said, over every movement, there hovered a subtle, exquisitive enchantment. Everything expressed the unique, peculiar force of the life which played within her. Her face, too, was constantly changing. It, too, was always in play. It seemed at almost the same instant mocking, pensive, and passionate, and an infinite variety of feelings, light and swift, succeeded each other like shadows of clouds on a windy summer day, in her eyes and on her lips. Every one of her admirers was necessary to her. By Lovzarov, whom she sometimes called my wild beast, or sometimes simply mine, would gladly have leaped into the fire for her. With no confidence in his own brains or other qualities, he was constantly proposing marriage to her, implying that the others only talked. Maidanov was responsive to the poetic strain in her soul, somewhat cold by nature. So they all kind of have their part. Like nearly all writers, he assured her fervently, and perhaps himself too, that he adored her. He composed endless verses in her honor and recited them with an ardor at once affected and sincere. She sympathized with him and at the same time faintly mocked him. She did not really trust him, and after listening to his effusions for a while, used to make him read Pushkin in order, as she used to say, to clear the air. Pushkin, the Russian author. Lushin, the sarcastic doctor, so cynical in his talk, knew her best of all and loved her more than the others, although he attacked her both to her face and behind her back. She respected him, but did not spare him, and sometimes with a peculiar malicious pleasure used to make him feel her complete power over him. "I'm a flirt, I have no heart, I have an actor's nature," she once said to him in my presence. "I'm a flirt, I have no heart, I have an actor's nature," she once said to him in my presence. "All right then, give me your hand and I will stick a pin into it, and you will feel ashamed in front of this young man, and it will hurt you, and still you will be kind enough to laugh, Mr. Truthful." Lucian flushed, turned away, bit his lip, but in the end stretched out his hand. She pricked it, and he did begin to laugh, and she laughed too, and drove the pin quite deep, and kept glancing into his eyes, which ran helplessly in every direction. Least of all did I understand the relations which existed between Zenaida and Count Malevsky. think he's an older one. He was good-looking, clever, and shrewd, but something false in him, something equivocal, was apparent even to me, a boy of 16. And I wondered that Zenaida did not notice it. But perhaps she did notice this falseness and was not repelled by it. An irregular education, odd habits and company, the perpetual presence of her mother, poverty and disorder in the house, everything beginning with the freedom which the young girl enjoyed, with her consciousness of superiority over her surroundings, had developed in her a curious, half-contemptuous kind of carelessness and unfastidiousness. I remember how, no matter what happened, whether Bonafatti announced there was no sugar left, or perhaps some squalid piece of gossip suddenly became public, or some quarrel broke out between the guests, she would only shake her curls and say, "Fiddlesticks," and leave it at that. But my blood, I remember, used to rise when Malevsky would sidle up to her like a sly fox, lean gracefully over the back of her chair and begin to whisper into her ear with a self-satisfied and wheedling little smile, while she would fold her arms and glance at him attentively, then smile herself and shake her head. "What induces you to receive Monsieur Malevsky?" I once asked her. "Ah, but he has such beautiful little mustaches," she replied, "and anyway, that is not your province." "Perhaps you think that I love him," she said to me on another occasion. "No, I cannot love people whom I find that I look down on. I need someone who would himself master me, but then, goodness me, I shall never come across anyone like that. I will never fall into anybody's clutches. Never, never." I'm going to highlight the whole shit. That's crazy. So she doesn't want to be controlled. "Does that mean that you will never love anyone?" "And what about you? Don't I love you?" she said, and flicked me on the nose with the tip of her glove. Yes, Zenaida made fearful fun of me. Zenaida made fearful fun of me. For 3 weeks I saw her every day, and there was nothing that she didn't do to me. She called on us seldom, and about this I was not sorry. In our house she became transformed into a young lady, a princess, and this made me shy of her. I was frightened of giving myself away to my mother. She did not think at all well of Zenaida, and watched us with disapproval. I was not so nervous of my father. He behaved as if he did not notice me, and he did not say much to her, but what he did say seemed somehow specially wise and significant. I ceased to work, to read, even to walk in the neighborhood or to ride. Like a beetle tied by the leg, I circled constantly round the adored lodge. I felt I could have stayed there forever, but this was not possible. My mother grumbled, and sometimes Zenaida herself used to drive me away. Then I used to lock myself in my room or go to the end of the garden, climb on to the ruin of a high stone greenhouse, and dangling my legs from the wall which looked out on the road, would sit for hours, staring and staring, seeing nothing. Near me, over the dusty nettles, white butterflies fluttered lazily. A pert little sparrow would fly down on to a half-broken red brick nearby, and would irritate me with its chirping, ceaselessly turning its whole body with its outspread tail. The crows, still wary, occasionally cawed, sitting high on the bare top of a birch, while the sun and wind played gently in its spreading branches. The bells of Donskoy monastery would sometimes float across, tranquil and sad, and I would sit and gaze and listen, and would be filled with a nameless sensation which had everything in it, sorrow and joy, a premonition of the future, and desire and fear of life. At the time I understood none of this, and could not have given a name to any of the feelings which seethed within me, or else I would have called it all by one name, the name of Zenaida. And Zenaida still played with me like a cat with a mouse. Sometimes she flirted with me, and that would excite me, and I would melt. At other times she would suddenly push me away, and then I dare not approach her, dare not look at her. I remember once that she was very cold with me for several days. I was completely unnerved. I would hurry timidly into the lodge, and then like a coward I would stay with the old princess, in spite of the fact that she was particularly noisy and querulous at this time. Garrulous at this time. Her financial affairs were going badly, and she had already had 2 encounters with the local police. Once I was in the garden when, passing the well-known hedge, I saw Zenaida leaning back on both her arms. She was sitting motionless on the grass. I was about to tiptoe away, but she suddenly raised her head and beckoned to me imperiously. I stood transfixed. I did not understand at once. She repeated the gesture. Immediately I leaped over the hedge and ran up to her happily, but she stopped me with a glance and pointed to a path 2 steps away from her. In my confusion and not knowing what to do, I went down on my knees on the edge of the path. She was so pale, every feature betrayed such bitter grief, such utter exhaustion that I felt a pang and murmured involuntarily, "What is the matter?" Zenaida stretched out her hand, plucked a blade of grass, bit it, and flung it away from her. "Do you love me very much?" she asked at last. "Do you?" I did not reply, and indeed what reason had I to reply? "Yes," she said, looking at me as before, "it is so. The same eyes," she added, then became thoughtful and covered her face with her hands. "Everything has become horrible to me," she whispered. "Why don't I go to the other end of the world? I can't bear it. I can't make it come right. And what is there before me? God, I am so wretched." "Why?" I asked timidly. Zenaida did not reply, but only shrugged her shoulders. I went on kneeling and looking at her with infinite distress. Every one of her words pierced my heart like a knife. At that moment I would, I think, gladly have given up my life if only that could end her grief. I looked at her and, still not understanding why she was so unhappy, conjured a vivid image of how, suddenly, in paroxysm of ungovernable grief, she had walked into the garden and fallen to the ground as though mown down. All round us it was bright and green. The wind murmured in the leaves of the trees, now and then bending the raspberry canes above Zenaida's head. Somewhere doves were cooing and bees were buzzing, flying low from blade to blade over the sparse grass. Overhead the sky was blue and tender, but I felt terribly sad. "Read me some poetry," says Zenaida in a low voice, and raised herself on one elbow. "I like your reading poetry. You speak it in a sing-song, but I do not mind it. That's youth. Read me On Georgia's Hills, only first sit down." I sat down and recited On Georgia's Hills. "Which it cannot help but love," Zenaida repeated after me. "That is what poetry can do. It speaks to us of what does not exist, which is not only better than what exists, but even more like the truth." "Which it cannot help but love. It would like not to, but cannot help itself." She was silent again and suddenly started and stood up. "Let's go. Martinov is with Mama. He has brought me his poem, but I left him. He is hurt too now, but what can one do? One day you will discover. Only don't be angry with me." She pressed my hand hastily and moved quickly forward. We went back to the lodge. Martinov began to recite us his recently published Murderer, but I did not listen. I guess that's his poem. He shouted his 4-foot iambics in a kind of sing-song. Iambics? The rhymes succeeded each other, ringing like sleigh bells, hollow and shrill, while I could only look at Zenaida, trying to grasp the meaning of her last words. "Or perchance it was some secret rival that sudden cast his spell on thee," exclaimed Martinov suddenly in a nasal tone, and my eyes and Zenaida's met. No. Exclaimed Martinov in a nasal tone. So, "Or perchance it was some secret rival that sudden cast his spell on thee." So that's you guys are reading. So he's saying, trying to grasp the meaning of Zenaida's last words, because she says, "Let's go. Martinov is with Mama. He has brought me his poem, but I left him. He's hurt too. He is hurt too now, but what can one do? One day you will discover. Only don't be angry with me." So she pressed my hand hastily and moved quickly forward. We went back to the lodge. Martinov began to recite to us his recently published Murderer, but I did not listen. He shouted his 4-foot iambics in a kind of sing-song. The rhymes succeeded each other, ringing like sleigh bells, hollow and shrill, while I could only look at Zenaida, trying to grasp the meaning of her last words. And then now we go to that little part. "Or perchance it was some secret rival that suddenly cast a spell on thee," exclaimed Martinov suddenly in a nasal tone, and my eyes and Zenaida's met. She lowered hers and blushed slightly. I saw her blush and froze with terror. I was jealous of her before, but only at that instant did the thought that she was in love flash through my mind. My God, she has fallen in love. I wonder with who, though. So, or perchance it was some secret rival that sudden cast his spell on thee. I'm not sure. Anyway, Martinov. So he says, "She lowered hers and blushed slightly. I saw her blush and froze with terror. I was jealous of her before, but only at that instant did the thought that she was in love flash through my mind. My God, she has fallen in love." I want to go back to this part right here. When she asked him, "Do you love me very much?" She asked at last, "Do you?" I did not reply, and indeed, what reason had I to reply? And then she answers it for him. Yes, she said, looking at me as before. And then she continues, it is so. Like, yes, it is so. And she says, it is so, the same eyes. So she's saying, like, I can still tell you love me. Like, she says, do you love me very much? Do you? He said he doesn't reply. And she says, yes, it is so, the same eyes. I just want you guys to get that part. Like, she sees it in his eyes that he still loves her. But then she says, one day you will discover, only don't be angry with me. So she said, he has brought me his poem, but I left him. And she says, he is hurt too now, but what can one do? One day you will discover, only don't be angry with me. I wonder why she says, one day you will discover. I'm confused too, guys, but yes, makes it interesting. It's the end of chapter 9. I loved it, man.